How can we fight misinformation in news? That's the topic of today's live stream for Wikilection. Adriel Briscoe. There isn't a guest speaker today, so we can just jump right in. This is the first live stream you're watching. The goal of these live streams are to provide information about Wikilection to the people watching, and then as well for me and just the project itself to improve the design of Wikilection, so the plans that we have, and to get better at explaining it, these sort of complex topics through the lenses that we're going through, which the topics that we tend to cycle through for these live streams. There's news, which is today's, and then politics and science. And every 2 weeks we tackle one of those, and then we look back, where the idea is we'll always present the topic in the current state. We'll answer any questions and receive feedback, so that can be from other guests participating, but also through comments either live, and then as well watching the recordings for any feedback after they're no longer live. And then based on that feedback, refine the plans, and then the next time the topic is covered, we'll have a new sort of current state of that topic, and that's how improvements are made to the content. Over the course of all of these topics, there's the overarching theme of using evidence to fight misinformation. And in this context, evidence refers to any information that can help prove something is true. So examples include scientific reports, some things that a journalist might use, like eyewitness testimony or video interviews, and also things like court records and any other data provided by the government. Now, in order to talk about how we plan to help with sort of current events and with news, we'll talk a bit about the existing model. Now, the first thing to talk about with the existing model is the public. So that, of course, the public in this case are the group of everyone who needs to understand what's going on in the world. And that often requires understanding complex information from a variety of disciplines or industries, right? So things like you have to be able to understand science, you have to be able to understand economics and politics and legislation. There's a lot people have to understand in order to properly digest a topic. And in this context, everyone is a member of the public, even the experts that will talk about that topic in a bit. But even those experts are still a member of the public in other realms. So the example that's shown there is an expert economist is probably still going to have to require a scientist to explain, like an actual scientific paper or sort of more complex scientific topics. Now, the first, or I guess the outer ring there, that's the one actually exposed to the public, are what we're calling a channel. And so a channel that's made to produce content to provide information to the public. In general, it's going to act as a filter because there's a lot going on in the world, and you can't really effectively talk about everything, because if everything is important, nothing is important. And so this is commonly what we'll see in the form of something like a national TV news or your local radio news, and then things like YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, that kind of thing. The challenges with that model are that introduces editorial bias. So you've got a group of people that are deciding what should and shouldn't get published, and of course that is going through human beings who are going to have their own biases. There's sensationalizing, where it's taking something that just isn't that big of a deal and blowing it out of proportion because that channel needs the clicks, the people reading the story, that sort of thing. And then you've also got selective omission, where it's just choosing not to talk about a story. So it might just be that they didn't think it was interesting enough, but it can also be that it doesn't fit the narrative that channel is trying to build, and so they exclude important stories. I will apologize in advance. I think someone's vacuuming out in the hallway in my building, so we'll see how loud that gets. And of course, they just stopped now that I've said that. So we're talking about channels. Next are the experts. So the experts are the individuals that are explaining and discussing those complex topics. And if they're being presented as an expert through the channel, they're assumed to have some level of expertise in the thing they're talking about. So the examples for experts are going to be things like scientists, politicians, economists, and journalists, where the journalists will actually typically sort of be a part of the channel itself, but they also sort of have their own expertise as far as, what makes a good source, how do you validate something as true, and they kind of, I guess, almost act as the internal expert for a channel. Now, the challenge is at this level, you can have your biased experts, which kind of ties into the next item listed there as well for conflicts of interest, where you might just have somebody biased because of things they believe, or they might be biased because their paycheck depends on it. There is definitely a challenge of the public doesn't always know if the expert being presented, is truly, I guess, a full expert in that realm. So if they, there's a lot of times where, for example, in the current COVID-19 crisis, there are a lot of experts being brought out, but with how much they disagree with each other, it's almost certain that some of the doctors being brought out to talk about this aren't actual medical doctors and have no actual knowledge of immunology and the kind of expertise you probably should have if you're going to be chiming into this conversation, especially with advice contrary to people who are experts. We'll talk about that. That's experts. Now, the experts are typically brought in to discuss some form of evidence, and the types of evidence experts use is going to change based on, I guess, what kind of expert they are, so what sort of industry they come from, and the expert being used in the channel is generally going to involve some sort of expertise to correctly identify and reference that content. So both it's content worth referencing, and then also is that expert correctly referencing that content if it is good. And we already talked a bit about the examples of evidence, like scientific records and court records, that kind of thing. And the challenges with evidence, there's the verification. So there's the evidence itself. Is it good evidence? If it's a scientific report, was it properly, was the experiment properly designed? Does the report have all the necessary elements to, have a scientist say, okay, this at least appears to be correctly designed and I can't, pick anything apart in the content itself. Then there's the issue of, is it being accurately referenced, right? You can take a really good, reliable, well-trusted piece of evidence and you can inaccurately reference it to sort of make it seem like it agrees with you, even if it doesn't. And then there are the cases where you can cherry pick examples. So if there's 10 pieces of evidence on a topic and 9 of them lean one way and just one leans the other way, and you're reporting on that one, kind of dishonest not to at least mention, hey, there's 9 other pieces of evidence out there that are contrary to this. And that's assuming that they all seem to be relatively the same trust level. If the 9 pieces of evidence aren't very good and the one is, then it probably makes sense to use that one. But that's what that means by cherry picking examples. Now, the outcome of what this media model sort of means in the current day, talk about the 3 sort of, I guess, paragraphs on the right there. So first is organizational bias. And some channels are heavily biased and they tell a deceptively single-sided story. And that can include the things that were talked about previously, like sensationalizing and selective omission, or presenting extreme or fringe positions as mainstream, right? Which can happen when you take, like, this happens a lot with identity politics, where the various news stories will talk about somebody on the other side. They'll find some crazy fringe position that probably not even 1% of people agree with, and report on it as though it's, hey, maybe more people have this point of view to paint the opposing side as irrational. And then you've got your one-sided narrative, which that implies sort of the obvious truth that's being presented. And so the opposing side is usually painted as either stupid or evil, because they don't agree with the outcome of this single-sided narrative. That's really common in documentaries, where they'll paint, a very one-sided approach and they don't show any of the countering evidence. And it could be that the documentary is still right, but it's being painted as, hey, all the evidence is on our side. So, if you don't agree with it, you're probably either stupid or evil. And then finally, he's talking about conflicting information, where if you are consuming more than one channel of information, and you happen to be consuming channels where they conflict with each other, that starts to sort of paint a worrisome picture for anybody watching to say, well, wait, if they both paint that, really compelling one-sided narrative, but they disagree with each other, then at least one of them is lying. So to help visualize some of this, in the top left here, we're talking about the playbook for these sort of very biased organizations, their playbook for how to talk about the news and how to talk about information. So we can look at when there's something positive that happens about either that organization themselves or one of their allies. Of course, they're going to publicize it. They're going to make sure everyone knows about it. They're going to sensationalize it. Even if it's a small thing, they're going to blow it up and say this is world changing. And then they're going to assign responsibilities to themselves and their allies and saying this great thing's because of us. And as you can see, that exact same playbook happens when something negative happens for a rival, right? Again, they publicize it. They want to make sure people know about it. They sensationalize it. So if it's something small, they're going to make it bigger and sound more important. And again, they're going to make sure that anybody who watches that piece of content knows who they should assign responsibility for this bad thing to, which is the rival. Now, the flip side of that is what happens when something negative happens for an ally or something positive happens for a rival, which is their first game plan is just not to mention it, right? And that's the selective omission. That's if there's a bad story about an ally, we're just going to try not to talk about it. If it gets big enough where they're forced to talk about it, then they minimize the importance and say, well, it's not that important. So kind of the opposite of sensationalizing. And then finally, they'll discredit the people involved. So if it's something negative about their allies, they'll say, anybody that's acting as a source, acting as an expert, trying to help build that story, well, they're bad at their job for whatever reasons. And of course, that's the same thing for if something positive happens for a rival, you don't mention it, or if you're forced to mention it, you say it's not that important, or the people saying it are discredited for whatever reason. And then as a visualization for the conflicting information, we see in the bottom left where we have channels A and B. And that top group on the right, which says believes A, that's showing people that are only exposed to channel A, and their compelling story. So they believe whatever channel A is saying. And then at the bottom there, you see believes B. They're only being exposed to channel B. Again, compelling story. They have no reason to disbelieve it. So they believe in whatever channel B is saying. Now, the middle group there for conflicting information, those are the people that are being exposed to both channel A and channel B. And in this case, we're saying that channel A and B disagree with each other, but they're sort of painting their compelling story using their one-sided narrative. But if you're watching both of those, you can see something doesn't match. So, at least one of them is lying. And that's kind of where the trust starts to break down. So next, we'll talk about what the proposed solution is for the news and how Wikilection plans to help fight misinformation. So you can see the part on the left there is what we just went through. And then on the right, we're talking about the sort of how Wikilection would handle this differently. So we'll start, this arrow should actually be in the middle here. We're starting from the inside out on this side. So for the evidence, one of the important things there is a community review. So experts within the community can review all the underlying evidence for any issues, right? So if it's a scientific study, maybe they didn't properly design the study, maybe, the person who wrote it listed qualifications they don't actually have, whatever it is, the community goes through and sort of reviews the evidence itself. And that kind of review is going to be based on the type of evidence. So you can't really use the same criteria to assess like a video interview done by a journalist compared to, a scientific report. Those are going to have very different criteria for if that piece of content or that piece of evidence is trustworthy. And it might even be different within the same sort of sphere, right? So with scientific reports, a report on astronomy might be different than a report on biology and that kind of thing. So there's the content itself and looking at was the study properly designed, et cetera. Next is to look at who the creator is. So who actually created that piece of evidence? Who's the scientist or who's the organization involved? Just so we can track, what else have they made in the past? And if we can start to say, hey, this one scientist, they always have really good papers. They always seem to pass the community review. Whereas another author, maybe it's the opposite. And maybe it's always junk and it's always improperly designed. And you can tell they're just trying to form a study that proves a certain point that they're being paid to prove. And just any possible conflicts of interest, even if there's no evidence, if that creator and their organization stands to make money off the topic at hand, it's not to say that the evidence is wrong and should be discarded, but you probably want some other outside opinions as well to say, hey, do people agree with this, even if they don't stand to make money off of it? And then finally, we're talking about the similar evidence, which goes a bit back to the cherry picking examples from evidence, where if we can look at that same example from before of the 10 pieces of content talking about the same thing, and 9 have one outcome that they all sort of agree with each other on, and you have that one outlier, it's to review all of them to make sure we know which ones are good and, I guess, properly designed. And then if they all are, well, anytime that one piece of evidence that the other 9 disagree with is being presented, again, it's not to say it's wrong. It's just to make sure that people can see the context of, hey, this piece of evidence seems good, but so do these other 9 that disagree with it. So heads up. So we start in Wikilection with this underlying collection of evidence. And then the evidence is then, it can also be linked to the experts involved. And that can be the experts that created it. That can be the scientist in the previous step. That can be possibly, like a science journalist that wrote an article about a report. In this case, you would want to know about the scientist and the journalist as well. So when we're talking about all of those different kinds of experts, an important part is to have a profile for the experts involved, so that we can, know over time, is this person brand new in the industry and this is the first time that they're chiming up on this topic? Have they been talking about this for 20 years and they have a really good track record? Again, do they have any conflicts of interest? That sort of thing. In the beginning stages of Wikilection, we'll need to rely fairly heavily on the qualifications of the experts, right? So things like if a scientist wants to chime in, what sort of qualifications do they have, right? Did they go to school for science? What sort of a degree do they have? What area of science did they study? So we're giving some emphasis to, hey, this person is actually a professional in this category, versus, maybe they're not the exact kind of scientist, but they still know enough about science to be able to properly review if, an experiment was properly designed. Or they might not have any kind of a science background at all, and you can tell that they're just being presented because they agree with whatever point is being touted. Now, an important thing about experts is this also includes politicians. Experts doesn't actually mean that they are an expert. It really just means that someone is claiming that this person is an expert, right? Like if a channel brings in a scientist to talk about something, there's sort of an implication there that, hey, we brought them on to talk about this because they're qualified, because they're skilled in this area. And in theory, people, I think, largely either do or should, when a politician is talking about a topic, they're presenting themselves as an expert. And so it's important to be able to review how expert they are on that topic, right? You'll regularly see politicians talk about the economy and science and a bunch of stuff. And just because a certain politician might be great at talking about, well, let's say the economy and business, does not mean that they'll be good at talking about science. And so each one sort of has its own track record. So you can start to see over time who's making these predictions and who's saying things that end up being true. And that's where we can start to get away from being so heavily emphasized on their qualifications. So even if you don't have a science degree, or you have a degree in something, not about the topic at hand, like if you're, an astronomer and talking about biology, well, if we have a track record of you talking about biology and you're right 98% of the time, we might not care what your technical qualifications are because you're correct a lot. And the same is the reverse. If you have qualifications, all the qualifications you could possibly want, but you're wrong so often that maybe we don't care about that expert's opinion as much as somebody who's actually correct. As just hinted in the previous bit, so we'll track that experts make claims, and then we'll actually have the community of other experts and just the community at large review those claims. So not just reviewing the evidence, but also saying when an expert is saying something about a piece of content, is that claim accurate? And we'll talk about that in a bit more depth in a couple of slides, talking about sort of how it's the quality of the content and how that differs from the quality of the referencing of the content. And then the final piece about experts, which is kind of related to the expert claims as well, is just to show how often this person agrees or disagrees with their industry. And then tied to that, how often they're correct, right? So you might have the one outlier scientist who disagrees with all of their peers and they're wrong a lot. You probably don't want to trust them. But if you have sort of the pro who doesn't necessarily agree with their industry, but it seems like when you look in the past, most of the cases where they disagree with the experts, they end up being right. Well, those can kind of appear as the same situation to the average person, but without the data to back it up, how are you supposed to tell the difference? So it's important to sort of see the industry average of what is everyone saying, so that you can, have some inkling on what more people are saying is probably true. But then over time, as you start to figure out who's actually correct more often, you can start to weigh that as well. And then finally, we're talking about the channels. And channels aren't quite the same thing for Wikilection, where you end up with sort of this pool of, or I guess a library of reviewed evidence, and then this library of experts and their profiles and things that they've said about the various topics at hand being discussed by the evidence. And then a part of Wikilection is just exposing that information and just having it available to people, but then still using those same tools to also review the content made by the other channels, right? So if we're talking about the underlying content of a scientific report and the experts, talking about it, we would dissect that. But then we're also looking at any news articles that are written about it. So we have the same kind of information as far as, this channel likes to talk about these areas in science, but in these particular areas, they appear to have some bias, or they, appear to not talk about certain things. So that's the content review here, is more about the reporting part of it. So like the journalist part of the channel is actually telling their stories. There needs to be a review of that content as well, which is kind of similar to reviewing the evidence, but a bit different, because usually this kind of content, it's not effectively saying anything new. It's not acting as evidence itself. It's discussing other evidence and possibly multiple pieces. But that can be important to both look at like the bottom item there called track channels. If we're tracking both the content and how accurate it ends up being, and we track what channel was doing that, we can start to get a picture of how accurate are these channels, what topics do they tend to be honest about and they end up being correct, and which topics maybe that channel's not that trustworthy. Maybe they have some conflicts of interest or just not the best experts, or whatever the reason ends up being. With all of this, from the evidence to the experts to the channels, a part of when the community is reviewing it is to flag sort of different topics or interests, to say, hey, this topic is about, public safety and about biology and about the different things that the community says that, these things are about. And then as a user of Wikilection, you kind of become your own channel for yourself, where you're able to filter this big ocean of information that's out there and filter it down to the topics you want to see. Now, it's not quite the same as the channel, where you've got your sort of a narrative it's trying to tell, where there's a person in that channel deciding what does and doesn't get talked about. When you're filtering by interest, it's saying, I'm interested in science. I'm interested in public safety, that sort of thing. It's going to show you all the information that people have flagged as being about that topic, regardless of if you would agree with it or not. If you say you're interested in science, it shows you science. And part of that will be stuff you probably agree with, but part of it probably won't be as well. And then it becomes that conversation around how do we, check to see it's accurate? How do we know that we can trust it? But that's one of the big differences from the current model, is that people sort of get to decide what they want to filter. And it's just filtering based on topic, not based on the information bubbles that we sort of tend to arrange ourselves in online, especially in social media, and in just the channels that we choose to follow. Now, some of the features that will be available in Wikilection or something similar will need to be available in order to actually facilitate this kind of dissection of the news, if you will. So the first one is a screenshot that's also shown in the politics area, and that is what we're calling events or important events. And this tracks individual events that sort of happen, and it also tracks what role each person played in that event. So you might have, here in the example shown, it's showing the abuse of power, which happened to, Stephen Connor. In this case, he was the one that actually supposedly did the abuse of power. You can see there's sort of a write-up underneath saying what the event is about. There's some articles underneath. Oh, I think that arrow's actually in the image, so I can't click on it. Never mind. The items underneath are the evidence. So that is actual news articles from, the local newspapers that are sort of backing up that that event, but it's probably not that legible in the screen share. The text of it sort of says it was never proven. So in the bottom right of the abuse of power part, it actually says it's only suspected. Now, whether or not this would end up showing in the final version actually would depend partially on how much evidence there really is. And the Wikilection community will at some point need to decide what that threshold is for, like, if we're pretty sure it happened to show it versus maybe we're not sure enough that it happened. So we're still tracking it so we can see the evidence involved, but maybe we don't, show that from the get-go if we're not fairly sure it happened. Talk about this for the evidence, that's good. And then on that same sort of topic with the events, there's also cases where you'll have multiple events. So in the example shown here, it was actually the precursor to the abuse of power event, where this person was given warnings for having excessive expenses. And above the little blue box in the middle that says excessive expenses, right above that, there's these 3 blue lines that sort of come out of it and point to an item on the timeline. And that's meant to show the 3 times that happened. So the goal here is to track as much as possible about somebody's history, about sort of their time spent in office, that sort of thing. And anything that might be, interesting or important for voters or the public to know. But if the person does, 20 of the same thing, we don't want their timeline to just be 20 of that. We want to sort of show it once, say, hey, this thing happened 20 times, to sort of free up space to show other things. And it is important to note that this shouldn't only be negative things. It is important that, for politicians, for experts, anything positive that happened, we want to make sure we're capturing that as well, because it is important to sort of know which politicians and in which areas, can be trusted and, actually are good and do have the kind of history that they claim to have, that sort of thing. Now, if we're talking a bit more about the evidence and sort of how it can bubble up to prove or disprove something, this very basic diagram shows, so we'll talk about the evidence at the bottom first. So this bottom layer here called evidence is meant to be the individual articles, like, the scientific papers, that sort of thing. So we have 5 articles here being shown. The color is meant to indicate sort of the quality of that piece of evidence, right? So after it's been reviewed, is it good quality or bad quality, or is it sort of, we don't know yet. So of course, green is supposed to be showing good quality, orange is bad, and then gray is we aren't sure yet. And then the layer above are the claims being made. So what are the actual things that people are saying are true or false, and that they're trying to back up with the, using the parts of these scientific reports to justify it. And so if you're thinking of, any sort of like a scientific conversation around, is a certain ingredient safe? Is a certain thing, safe or dangerous, or what is it? You might have a claim, right? Like in the vaccine debate, there's a lot of claims around certain ingredients being unsafe or safe. So you're going to have sort of two sides of the same claim coin saying, like, let's say formaldehyde is safe or unsafe. And there's, there's a claim for each, where they're sort of the opposite. So both couldn't end up being true. So if claim A is saying that something is safe, and these arrows underneath are, the pieces of evidence that claim is referencing to justify its claim, you can see it's being referenced by, or it is referencing articles 1, 2, and 5. So 1 and 2 are good, 5 is unknown. So overall, claim A is good, right? It's got a decent amount of good content supporting it. So that one seems like it's probably true. Claim C is maybe a different claim about, a different ingredient being safe or unsafe, and it's referencing two pieces of evidence, Article 1 and 5. So in this case, Article 1 still good. Article 5, we're still not sure. So that it still is probably good. So it's still showing as green, but it's showing as a lighter green because we aren't quite as sure. It doesn't have as many good pieces of evidence backing it up. So, not super sure on that one. And then claim E, it's referencing, again, the claim, if we're saying it's, something is safe or unsafe, it's referencing Article 3 and Article 5. Now, Article 5 is that same one that we aren't sure about. You can tell it's probably pretty weirdly worded if all three of these claims are all referencing it. But then it also references Article 3. And Article 3 is showing up in orange. So that is where we say that's probably not so good. So claim E is only being supported by a piece of bad evidence and a piece of unknown evidence. So in this case, it's kind of a lighter orange saying, it's still, we aren't 100% sure that it's wrong, but so far things aren't looking good for that claim. And then the top layer would be, in this case, it's saying articles, because we could be saying, hey, this article showing in green, it's making two claims, claim A and claim C, that are then being backed up by the underlying evidence. So if an article was doing that, it would be showing up in green because it's made two claims that can be somewhat defended, and so that's being shown as a positive. And then we have a different article that's making claim E, and the evidence that it's using to justify it is not being, is not great. So it is showing up as orange. So that's sort of how, from the information contained in an article, how we can try to figure out if that article is true or not. And most likely it'll end up being not so cut and dry as this. You'll end up, with like 7 correct claims and 3 incorrect claims. It can get a bit murky. But this is sort of the easier example of how that is being shown. I thought I put it in this section. I guess not, but it does seem important to talk about. We're talking about referencing evidence and sort of the quality of the evidence and the quality of the reference. Here's a fairly basic, I don't know if diagram is the right word, but I'll go with it. Here's a diagram showing sort of 4 different quadrants of where evidence quality intersects with how good the claim is. So just a recap, the evidence quality is talking about the actual evidence itself, right? So if it's a scientific report, that means that when scientists read that report, they don't have, alarms going off in their head saying that this is BS. It passes whatever measures of quality for that kind of content. Then for the claim reference, it's just being said, is this claim accurately representing what the evidence is actually saying? So if your evidence piece, is a scientific report, then are you accurately portraying both what the report, sort of how it was designed and the thing itself, but then also what any outcomes or learnings from that report were. So if you have high quality evidence that people who review it trust, and it's being accurately referenced, that's something that, as far as we can tell, is trustworthy. That's kind of your best case scenario. You can also have cases where somebody's accurately referencing a piece of content, but the content's not great, right? So they are doing their best. They read it, they probably understood it to some extent, and they're referencing it. But when a bunch of people get together and look at that piece of content, they're like, yeah, I don't trust this, right? Whether it was an improperly designed scientific experiment, or it's a video that some people think has been edited, that kind of thing. So even if you're accurately referencing low quality evidence, that's still not very useful for a conversation to learn if something is true or not. And then you can also have somebody inaccurately reference a piece of high quality content. And so there, you've got your really good scientific report that was written by somebody who knows what they're talking about, and everybody in the industry that reads it says, yeah, that makes sense. That seems, well designed and trustworthy. But then the person trying to reference that piece of content in, their own news article or wherever it's being referenced, if they reference it inaccurately, then it doesn't matter how true or how good that piece of evidence is if they're trying to put their spin on it to put it through their own lens, where people who are reviewing that claim say, well, the piece of evidence is good, but this part here, where they quoted a certain stat out of context or something like that, is an inaccurate way to represent that content. So again, it's not trustworthy, even though the evidence might be. And then the worst case is where you've got low quality content being inaccurately referenced, and that's just bad. That's just yikes, as it says there. That's definitely not something that you want to trust. But in the end, I would personally say maybe not that much less trustworthy than either of the other oranges: the low quality evidence accurately referenced, or the high quality evidence inaccurately referenced. So that is the basics for news for Wikilection. We're talking about there. I don't think there's anything else that's science. Double check to see if there's any comments. No. Okay. So that will be it for today's live stream. I believe the next topic that we'll go through is probably going to be politics. So that's going to be in 2 weeks. And there's a good chance that we'll have a guest for those. This news session does seem to be the one that's the least interesting of the three, and I don't think we've had a guest on this topic yet. Hopefully for the next one. If you do have any questions, feel free to leave a comment on the video, or actually let me switch back to that first page there. That's got that. You can find out more information about Wikilection either at the website, www.wikilection.com, or you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Wikilection. And then if you're following on YouTube, you can also choose to subscribe there. So far, this is the YouTube channel is just being used for these live streams, but that will likely change over time, and we'll start to have new content there as well. But that is sort of the best way to keep in touch. And if you have any questions, you can also feel free, to actually send us some messages on Facebook or use the form on Wikilection. So I think that covers it for today. Thank you for your time, and hope to see you again in the future. Cheers.